Learning major scales gives you superpowers. I'm not even joking here. Now, I don't mean you're going to be able to levitate instruments with your mind or make people listen to your 9-minute bass solo, and there are an awful lot of things you need to learn as a musician. But I truly believe that learning all my major scales was the single project that made the biggest positive difference to my musicianship, and unlocked abilities and understandings that I could not have anticipated. And some of the skills I acquired in that process really are considered by some people to be musical superpowers. Things like sight reading, transposing into other keys, improvisation, ear training, and actually understanding music theory. Sadly, we don't have a musical super serum yet. So think of this project like a superhero training montage. In every scene, you're getting stronger, smarter, more agile, and capable on your instrument. You'll start to see past the code of music theory and make connections you couldn't see before. Now, maybe you're hesitant about this. This may sound like a lot of work about complicated musical stuff that you don't really care about. So before I jump into how these musical superpowers work, give me a moment to explain how everyone can benefit almost immediately from learning even just a few scales, and why learning them all isn't even as big a project as you might think. First off, don't even worry about all the scales at first. Just focus on learning one, maybe C major, because it's all the natural notes. Or, depending on your instrument, it might make more sense to learn one of these, which only have one or two sharps or flats, so they're not too scary. After you've learned one, learn the next one. While you're tackling these first few scales, you're already gaining the most important and fundamental benefits. You're learning note names and fingerings, sequentially in a clear pattern. The power and utility of this is not to be underestimated. Many musicians learn songs mostly by ear and repetition, even when there's sheet music in front of them. So they learn Twinkle Twinkle, but freeze when presented with a new piece, even if it's based on the same notes. Because they didn't really learn their notes, they just learned one song. Learning note names and fingerings is fundamental to learning to read music, and a scale is the perfect exercise to do that. You're also building physical strength. It might not seem difficult to press buttons or strings or blow down a tube, but new musicians do get tired just holding their instrument and their bodies in the correct position. And for some instruments, particularly wind and brass, you have to spend time learning to play very high and low notes. Even strings, guitars, and basses will have different amounts of hand stretch across the instrument. Scales are perfectly suited exercises to explore and expand your range while building physical strength and endurance. And if you're doing this while playing with a metronome, which you really should, you'll have specific data points on where you're strong and where you need to improve. You'll learn how to play a difficult passage at a slow tempo and speed it up. And most fundamentally, you'll be working on tempo control and learning to play with steady time, which is one of the most important skills for absolutely any musician. Scales are standard exercises for musicians, just like when an athlete runs laps, swims lengths, or does push-ups to build and maintain strength and agility. It's also why dancers and martial artists run standard routines and exercises to help make difficult and complex motions into effortless ones. So maybe you're fine with learning those basic scales with just one or two sharps or flats, and those basic benefits do seem pretty useful. But you look at the rest of those scales, and whether or not there's superpowers on the way, it still feels overwhelming. But remember, if you tackle them in order, you only need to learn a few new notes at a time. You start with the easy ones, and after a while, the ones with 3 or 4 sharps or flats don't really look so scary, because there's only a couple of new notes in each scale. As you progress, the later scales don't look like such insane challenges anymore. They're just what's next. Second, there's a significant psychological benefit to picking a challenge like this and completing it. You'll learn that none of these scales are truly difficult. Some are just new and unfamiliar, and learning them is just a process. Some people say you climb a mountain because it's there, but honestly, this mountain really isn't even that big, because this really doesn't take all that much time if you've got a decent practice routine. Imagine you take one scale each month to work on for a bit every time you warm up. At that pace, you'd be done learning all your scales in about a year. A year is a long time, and it kind of isn't. Hopefully you'll be playing music for a long time, maybe the rest of your life, in which case a year is nothing. A year in the future feels long, but a year ago, not so much. Imagine if you'd started a year ago, you'd be done already. But actually, if you're smart about it, you can do it much faster. I did a whole video about muscle memory and repetition and how small increases add up way faster than you think they do. You'll have to watch the video for more detail, but basically, if you can endure playing a scale really slowly and gradually increasing the tempo, you can actually take a scale from excruciatingly slow to very fast in just 10 minutes. It's literally a 3,000% increase in speed. It sounds crazy, but I've done it myself and with my students successfully many times. With this routine, you could work through all your scales in a matter of weeks. And after you've learned them all, it takes no time at all to review them. This is definitely one of those work smarter, not harder sort of things. One of the most ubiquitously feared topics in music is sight reading. If I had a nickel for every time someone told me they like playing music but hate sight reading, I'd have like 100 nickels, which is not a lot of money, but it's crazy how often it happens. People really do treat it like a superpower. So, how do scales help? Lots of ways. First of all, most pieces of music are in one key, and mostly use notes from that key. So if you're playing a piece in the key of E flat major, it's really good to know the E flat major scale, because these notes are going to show up a whole lot, and these ones probably much less often. When you know your scales, it's almost like your brain learns that when you're in the land of E flat major, all the B's and E's and A's are flat. But if you travel to the realm of A major, everything changes, because now all the F's, C's, and G's are sharp. And the better you know your scales, the more you'll start to recognize patterns from scales in music, because what is music but scales and parts of scales? Just like when you read written language, when you see words you already know, your brain doesn't read each individual letter. It usually just sees and recognizes entire words all at once. Sometimes you see a new word that's unfamiliar, and you have to sound it out and figure out how to read it. But after you've read a lot and have a decent vocabulary, you've seen most words and read them without hesitation. For music, the first step to building that vocabulary is learning major scales. And you can increase these abilities even further by not only learning scales, but by practicing scale patterns, like all these variations of the C major scale, which can powerfully increase your musical vocabulary. Another superpower you get from scales is transposition. That is changing music from one key to another. This is useful for musicians who play transposing instruments like trumpet or saxophone, who need to transpose music from concert pitch. Or if you're working with a singer who wants to move a song into a key that better fits their vocal range. It works like this. Try thinking of scales not just as note names, but as numbers related to the first note of the scale. So, when you play a piece, think of each note as how it corresponds to its position in the scale. If you can do that, you can play this song in any scale that you know. Just play the note that corresponds with that number in the scale. And this ability to think of scales and numbers is incredibly useful for ear training. There's a system of naming notes called solfege, which uses words instead of numbers. One advantage is that you can describe any note, even sharps and flats, abstractly in relation to the home key using a single syllable. With practice and exposure, you start to hear patterns and relationships between notes. Having labels for these positions can be really helpful to mentally categorize and remember those relationships. Working on this skill will help you quickly pick up melodies, bass lines, and even chords by ear, not to mention composing music and even sight-singing sheet music that you've never heard before. And this concept of thinking in numbers is closely related to how almost all of music theory and harmony is related to the major scale. Now, just so you know, this section is going to go real quick and skip over a lot of details because there's a lot to cover. But do feel free to pause at any moment to inspect the visuals and definitely check my channel for a deep dive on any of these concepts. First, key signatures are pretty fundamental to all of music theory. I've actually made 2 videos about them. But keep in mind that every key signature is associated with a major scale, and it's far easier to understand and remember key signatures when you know your scales. From there, we move to chords, which are built from scales. A C major chord is just the first, third, and fifth note of the C major scale. And you can build chords on every note of the major scale in exactly the same way. They all have specific names, which we'll cover in a moment, but we often describe chords as a number related to the main scale of the piece, like this very common pop rock chord progression, which we can describe as 1, 5, 6, 4. This is useful because you're chunking a whole bunch of information into just a few numbers, which is just way easier to remember. We do this all the time without even thinking of it. Just like sometimes the directions to a new plays can require a lot of attention to detail, but after you've done it a few times, it just exists in your brain as one thing. Chords and chord progressions are no different. You also start to recognize how common patterns show up in songs all the time, so it's much easier to learn new songs when you think this way. And you can transpose chords into other keys pretty easily with this system. If you know the song has a chord progression of 1, 5, 6, 4, you just need to know what key the song is in to work out what the chords are. Learning scales also helps you start to understand how chord qualities work. You'll see this D minor triad that shows up in the C major scale and maybe wonder why it's called minor. But it's really obvious when you compare it to the D triad that's built on the D major scale. These chords differ by only one note. The third is a semitone lower. And other triads like diminished and augmented are easily understood by comparing them to the major triad. The more scales you know, the more chords you begin to instantly recognize and understand because it's all related. The same goes for 4-note chords, which are known as 7th chords because they are built from the root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th of a scale. They also come in a number of qualities, and many other chords are possible as well, but they're all generally understood as being related to or modifications of the major scale. And closely related to the idea of comparing and analyzing chords is intervals, which is how we describe the distance between notes. Most people tend to start with memorizing the interval names from the root to the other notes on the scale, which are all called major or perfect. And other types of intervals are just alterations from the intervals that occur in the major scale. And when you know all your scales, you begin to analyze intervals really quickly. It just sort of becomes second nature. You can also use major scales as a jumping off point for building and understanding other scales. For one, there's this thing called modes. They occur when you start a scale in a different place. C major is these notes, from C to C. But if we take the same notes and just play from D to D, that's not considered a C major scale anymore. That's actually called D Dorian. There are 7 modes in total for the major scale because you can start on any one of the 7 notes. And they all have a fancy Greek name. And of course, you can transpose these modes to any key using the exact same formula. Modes are useful for a number of reasons. For one, composing in a different mode than major is going to give you a really different sound. Try following the shape of a melody in all the different modes and see what kind of sounds you get. Modes also give us minor scales. The 6th mode of a major scale is also known as the natural minor scale, but we can modify it in a few ways to get other minor scales. All of these scales are modifications of one mode which comes from the major scale. And this concept of modifying existing scales is a very useful one. You can think of all kinds of scales as simply being modifications of the major scale. And you can even apply alterations to some of these scales to get some other weird new scales. These are just a few. One way or another, for most scales, major scales are your foundation. Finally, scales and modes are crucial for improvisation. It may seem that improvisation just comes naturally to some people. They just use their ears to find what sounds awesome and magically pluck amazing solos out of thin air. Of course, listening is always important in improv, but most improvisers are actually using scales to choose what notes will sound good and fit into the song they're playing with. There are no wrong notes in improvisation, just like there are no wrong flavors in cooking. But there are things that range from appropriate to adventurous. Think of learning scale and chord combinations like having a curated selection of ingredients, like at a salad bar, where almost any combination of what's available is going to taste at least okay. Improvisers learn what scales are implied by what chords. And though it takes a bit of experience and experimentation to build confidence, it's really not that hard if you have a pool of notes to choose from that you know are going to sound at least okay. And later on, you learn substitutions, embellishments, and other ways to spice up your improv. But it all comes from major scales, one way or another. Scales really are connected to almost everything in music. Having the facility to get around your instrument better and gain a deeper understanding of the relationships between notes, chords, and scales is going to help you play and read better, improve your ear training, learn to improvise, and understand theory and harmony better. Not to mention the fact that you'll be able to chunk together massive amounts of musical information, which will help with learning, memorization, and communication with other musicians. If you don't know what to practice, practice scales. They make just about everything better. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and check my channel for links for more videos. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching.